Alright, so here are just a few photos to briefly discuss one compositional technique. Now, I think it's important that you start with sort of one at a time. It's better to figure out one and understand how to do it, as opposed to think you understand all of them and mix them all up and get it all wrong. So we're going to start basic. The first one that I recommend is rule of thirds. It's super easy, not hard at all, and so that's why I recommend it. So, if you're not familiar with composition, that essentially means how you're putting what where in your frame. Now, depending on what type of photographer you are or you want to be, this might be less obvious or more obvious. If you're doing something like studio work where you can arrange everything yourself, easy. But if you're doing something where you don't want to manipulate anything, where you're doing stuff out in the field, or you're doing reportage style, well, it's a little more complicated because you're having to physically move yourself around to try to get things composed the way you want in the frame within the time limit of them doing whatever they're doing. But even still, rule of thirds is easy. So all it is basically imagine that you divide this canvas, this picture, your frame, into thirds. Your subject matter should fall somewhere along one of those third lines. Not right in the middle like a lot of people are used to doing, but instead right along the third line. Now, it doesn't have to be exact, it's kind of an approximation, but you can see here this plant lines up pretty much on the third line, especially where the focal point is. Here we have a duck. He's not perfectly on the rule of thirds, but he's close to it. He's definitely more so kind of a rule of thirds feel as opposed to right in the middle. It's also important where his eyeball is. The eye is definitely what we tend to focus on in other organisms or other people, so where those eyes are definitely makes a difference too. So even though his beak starts going into the middle, because his eye is off-center, that helps give it that rule of thirds feel, even if it's not exactly a perfect rule of thirds example. This little guy brings up two good points. Not only is he sort of on rule of thirds on the horizontal, but he's also pretty close to rule of thirds on the vertical as well. And to counterbalance him, you have sort of this little rule of thirds on the top left too, with that little partially eaten plant. Which there's some other things going on with that too, but we'll get into some of that stuff later. Now, if you're doing people, it's basically the same thing. Once again, you just put them on a rule of thirds line. Now, like the bird, part of her is not on the third line, but the face, the main part that we focus on, is. This one is a little bit even further out than rule of thirds, but you still get that general feel because our subject matter is off to the side. And lastly, even if you don't seem to have a subject, even if your subject is the land itself, you can still use rule of thirds. If you look at where the lines are, where the horizon is, and even where the boundary between the nice blue sky and the fluffy white clouds are, even those are sort of on rule of third lines. And so, you might be wondering, like, why does this matter? Why do we care about rule of thirds? And I mean, you don't have to. You don't have to use rule of thirds. It may say rule in the name, but it's more of a guideline. And even then, you shouldn't always have it in your final photo. Should you always consider it? Yeah, you should always consider it. But is it always going to be the best choice? No, it won't be. So essentially what happens, let's maybe go back to this little guy here. When we look at something, our eye naturally wants to move to the middle of that thing. So if we're looking at a picture, at a box, at a rectangle, our eye wants to move to the center. However, if our subject matter is not in the center, then our eye is going to move away from the center. But it still wants to move to the center. So you have this pull on the viewer between wanting to look in the center and wanting to look at the subject. And so that helps them move their eye around the frame and gives it a little bit of a different feel. On the other hand, if you drop it right in the center, it's going to be hard for them to look away from that central spot. Is that bad? Not necessarily. It depends on how you use it. So we have a statue of Buddha here, and I'm filming live, but I'm having to do voiceover later just because of wind and cicadas. But it's really pretty easy to switch this to a rule of thirds shot. Instead of having Buddha right in the center, as he is here, we just move the camera over a little bit to the right, and there we go. Now we have this rule of thirds shot, which gives us a lot of extra space that we can do other things with if we want to, and allows the eye to move around a little bit more. If I've already taken time out of my schedule to take these shots, I shouldn't just stop there, because what if that's not quite what I need? I should try other angles too. So I've just gone to the side of Buddha instead. Here we have him in the center. Once again, to set up a rule of third shot, I can just move the camera over a little bit, and there we go. Now, is this going to be the shot that I prefer? Maybe yes, maybe no. I might like the one with him right in the center better. I might like with the rule of third ones better. But until I'm actually using the photo, I'm not always going to necessarily know, and it's better to take both shots from multiple angles, as well as other shots too, than to realize afterwards that you have to go out and reshoot, especially if it's something that maybe isn't standing still and can't be taken photos of at any time, unlike the statue here.